Tonight, I have been given the honor of presenting an award named for my father, Alfred Moses. I want to thank Freedom House for giving me this opportunity, and I want to congratulate you on your 85th anniversary. Many of you know my father as a diplomat, as a philanthropist, as a patron of the arts and literature, or through his lifelong work on behalf of the Jewish community, both at home and abroad. In each of these roles, and in every chapter of his life, my father has been a steadfast and vigorous supporter of democracy, wherever it is threatened, both here and abroad. Now, I know my father is watching tonight. I don't mean that way. I mean he's home, watching on Zoom. So I want to express my appreciation also to my father for inspiring so many, including myself, to choose a life of public service. The Alfred Moses Liberty Award honors exemplary courage by political prisoners or outstanding efforts to secure their release. It shares the spirit of the Freedom House's globally recognized Free Them All initiative, which my father helped establish. Free Them All shines a light on political prisoners around the globe. The program is named in memory of the late Washington Post journalist, Fred Hyatt. We are grateful to Fred and to his wife, Pooh Shapiro, whose generosity helps sustain the program to this day. This year's awardee is the founder and leader of the Cuba Decide movement, Rosa María Payá Acevedo. Rosa Maria's activism was inspired by the pro-democracy work of her own father, Osvaldo Payá, and is guided by a deep belief that democracy must never be abandoned or taken for granted. Rosa Maria has turned that conviction into action. In Cuba, peaceful dissent is often punished with imprisonment or worse. Nonetheless, Rosa Maria has organized unprecedented coordination among pro-democracy forces in Cuba and across the hemisphere. The Cuba Decide movement is a nonviolent, nonpartisan grassroots campaign working towards democracy in Cuba. Rosa Maria also founded and serves as the executive director of the Foundation for Pan-American Democracy. She has built broad coordination across democratic actors in Cuba through the Freedom Accord, which is a roadmap for the restoration of democracy in Cuba, and across the hemisphere through the Latin American Youth Network for Democracy, which unites more than 100 organizations spanning 20 countries. In 2021, Rosa Maria established the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum, which forges legislative alliances to advance human rights on the global stage. Through these efforts, she has participated in and convened policy discussions, congressional engagement, public advocacy initiatives, and multilateral dialogue involving the OAS, the Organization of American States, the United Nations, the European Parliament, and the US government. Most recently, OAS member states elected Rosa Maria to a 4-year term as a commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is charged with promoting and protecting human rights throughout the Western Hemisphere. In honoring Rosa Maria, we recognize a leader whose work embodies a core principle long championed by Freedom House and by my father, that freedom flourishes where governments are chosen by and accountable to their people. Thanks to her persistence, her passion, and her moral clarity, Rosa Maria has ensured that political repression in Cuba has been and is met with global attention and principled action, perhaps never more so than today. Please join me in recognizing Rosa Maria Payá Acevedo.
Thank you so much for the special honor of receiving an award in your father's name. And my gratitude to Freedom House for sharing my father's spirit and for promoting the victories of democracy. Tonight, I do not stand before you in any official capacity. Rather, I want to speak to you first and foremost as a Cuban. I want to speak to you about Ernesto Brivá Sampé. Ernesto had a little child he had not seen in a very long time because he had been imprisoned since the protests of July 11, 2021, when the Cuban people rise in one cry for freedom. Yesterday, we learned that Ernesto had been dead for over a week. He died in prison from malnutrition because hunger is one of the many tortures to which political prisoners in Cuba are subject today. Let this recognition honor Ernesto and all Cuban political prisoners today. And let the world know this: the struggle for Cuba's freedom is more alive than ever. It lives in the prison cells where men like Felix Navarro continue the work of my father, Oswaldo Payá, who once embodied the democratic alternative of the Cuban people and was murdered by the Cuban regime in 2012. The fight for freedom in Cuba lives in the courage of young women like his daughter, Sailí Navarro. It lies in the memories of the political prisoners like Ernesto and the memory of many other civic leaders that are not with us today. It lives in the streets of the island where the protests do not cease, because despite the deep humanitarian catastrophe that the Cuban regime has forced into the Cuban people, despite the hunger, despite the lack of medicine, despite the lack of energy, despite the brutal repression, we Cubans, we are convinced that the only way to overcome the crisis is to get rid of the dictatorship, and we are risking everything to freedom. The struggle for freedom lives in the democratic alternative we have built, because we, Cubans, we are ready for change. The main democratic forces in Cuba and in exile are united in the Freedom Accord. It is a unified transition framework, a roadmap with 3 phases: liberation, stabilization and reconstruction, and democratization, culminating in what will be the first free, fair, and general elections in Cuba in over 70 years. Today, the United States announced the prosecution of Raúl Castro for his crimes against 4 American citizens. pilots that were rescuing refugees in the Florida Strait. This is an act of justice, but this is also after 30 years of the crime, in a moment in which the Cuban people is undergoing a very crucial, a very fragile moment. This is an act of solidarity. And we are grateful. We are grateful for every action of solidarity taken by the Cuban people's greatest ally today, which is the government of the United States. Today, we commemorate 124 years of independence. The Cuban Republic was born a century and a quarter ago, but still we are not celebrating freedom. However, I am convinced that we are standing at the threshold of change, because today the protests and civic mobilization in the streets demanding systemic change are converging with democratic Cuban forces that are united and preparing to manage the transition, together with the effective solidarity of the United States, pushing alongside us for the change our country so desperately needs. Because for us, for Cubans, achieving freedom, changing the system is existential. But Cuba matters for you too. Because Havana represents the longest running national security threat to the US and to the hemisphere. Because Havana is Putin's best ally. Because the regime is directly behind the largest migratory crisis of the modern history, displacing millions and destabilizing the entire region. Because the regime transformed Cuba's national territory into a sanctuary for terrorists. Because the regime is the home of spy bases from China, but the most affected of all has been Latin America. Tolerating 67 years of the Cuban communist dictatorship in the island of Cuba made impossible democratic stability in Latin America. The regime is behind the collapse and the maintenance, the collapse of democracy and the maintenance of the Venezuelan dictatorship. It's behind the centers of tortures in Nicaragua. It's behind the destabilization in Bolivia. And that's why a democratic change in Cuba is the key to restoring liberty throughout the region, and with it, peace, prosperity, and justice. The Cuban regime is the head. It has been for decades the head of the authoritarian octopus in our hemisphere. It is the Berlin Wall of the Americas, and tearing it down will require of all of us. But tearing down is the only thing we should do. As my father once said, the child, together with the people, of which it is an inseparable part, holds onto the hope of a new Cuba, where we all live in the fraternity of the children of God. The night will not be eternal. Thank you so much.